The cameras flashed, pens scratched, and history seemed to lean forward. $15 billion. That number did not simply echo in conference halls. It thundered across continents. For decades, Burkina Faso was dismissed as too small, too fragile, too dependent to matter. Yet on the day Ibrahim Traoré sat across from India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a new script began to be written. Not a story of aid dressed as generosity, not another cycle of loans turning into chains, but a pact of equals. Oil for technology, energy for industry, sovereignty for respect. This is not the tale of charity. It is the sound of chains breaking. It is the image of a continent standing taller, refusing to bow. What the world once labeled improbable is now a possibility pressing at the edges of the map. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and walk with us as we unfold the story. Because what began with ink on polished mahogany may soon redraw the lines of power across Africa and Asia. The question is not if change is coming, but how far it will go. The hall was lit by cameras, but what truly shone was the gravity of the moment. At the center of the polished table sat two men, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the soldier-turned-statesman who many once doubted, and Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, leader of a nation whose hunger for energy grows by the hour. When their pens touched at paper, the sum of $15 billion crystallized into a pact that was far more than arithmetic. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer remain in the waiting room of history. The figures are bold, precise, and staggering. $4 billion for oil extraction and refining, not just to ship crude abroad, but to climb the ladder of value-added production. $5 billion for petrochemicals and energy infrastructure, pipelines, storage, and processing plants that do not simply fuel India's growth, but power the workshops of Ouagadougou. $3 billion for steel and manufacturing, factories rising from Burkinabe soil, crafting rails, machines, and the very bones of tomorrow's industry. $2 billion for defense technology, because sovereignty without the means to defend it is like a castle without walls. $1 billion for agriculture, telecommunications, and training programs. Recognition that fertile fields and educated minds are the true foundations of strength. Each figure is more than an investment line. It is a seed planted in the soil of a nation. Factories are not just concrete and steel. They are promises of jobs for welders, of apprenticeships for engineers, of a paycheck that keeps food on the family table. Pipelines are not merely tubes in the ground. They are arteries of sovereignty, carrying lifeblood across the land. Defense workshops are not just buildings. They are statements that a nation will no longer rent its security from foreign powers, but forge it with its own hands. To understand the weight of this agreement, one must recall the decades of dependency that came before it. Aid shipments that arrived with the fine print of submission, loans that were celebrated as lifelines, only to become chains dragging entire generations into debt. Programs dressed in the vocabulary of development, but designed to keep Africa's role fixed. Exporter of raw goods, consumer of finished products. This pact, at least in its design, breaks that cycle. It is framed not as charity, not as debt, but as partnership. India secures the fuel that drives its rapid growth. Burkina Faso secures the industries, technologies, and skills that can anchor its modernization. It is a road paved not with pity, but with parity. Yet the symbolism runs deeper still. In the signature of Ibrahim Traoré lies a defiance of expectation. Critics called him too young, too reckless, too unseasoned to sit at tables where billions are bargained. But there he was, carrying not just the authority of his office, but the memory of his people. The farmer who sweated over dry soil, the miner who dug under foreign flags, the student who bent over books by candlelight. Each of them signed with him that day. Still, the ink on paper is not the same as steel rising from the ground or light bulbs flickering on in rural homes. Deals have been signed before, and too often they dissolved into corruption, bureaucratic stagnation, or projects that enriched the few while the many remained in darkness. The people of Kaya, Kudugu, Bobo Dioulasso know the sting of disappointment. For them, the test is not the press conference, but the paycheck, not the headlines, but the harvest. And so the question reverberates, will this $15 billion agreement remain a lofty promise, or will it trickle down into lived reality? Will the factories rise, the grids hum, the workshops train a new generation, or will profits slip abroad and ink fade into another chapter of betrayal? The ceremony was grand, but the stakes are grittier. In Ouagadougou's markets, A woman bartering for millet wonders whether her children will one day work in a plant powered by this pact. A taxi driver, hearing the news on his radio, shakes his head. Too many promises before. A student in Bobo Dioulasso dreams of coding software on machines manufactured at home, not imported at great cost. Their doubts, their hopes, are the true measure of this moment. Burkina Faso sits on reserves of oil and minerals that the world once dismissed as negligible, or hoped would remain locked until convenient for foreign exploitation. But in this deal, the key is turned by Burkinabe hands. For every barrel of oil that flows east, a stream of technology and training is meant to flow west. For every dollar of capital that arrives, a workshop of skills should take root in African soil. That is the vision. But will it hold when profit and politics clash? This is the heartbeat of the story. The contract is signed. The figures are public. The cameras have moved on. What remains is the harder task: to translate numbers into nourishment, cement into sovereignty, promises into progress. And as we stand at this juncture, one question presses like a drumbeat. Is this pact the seed of a harvest long awaited, or will it wither into yet another season of broken dreams? The signing was the spark, but the reactions were the fire. Within hours of the ink drying, headlines rippled across the globe. In Ouagadougou, cheers erupted in the streets as some saw a long-awaited chance for dignity. In Kaya and Kudugu, farmers asked whether new tools might finally arrive to ease their labor. In Bobo Dioulasso, students whispered that their generation might at last inherit not just poverty, but industry. For them, the moment carried a rare taste of pride, the thought that their nation had dared to negotiate as an equal. Yet pride at home was matched by unease abroad. In Washington, officials asked what this meant for the balance of alliances. In Paris, the whispers turned sharp. How could a former colony break free of the monetary and political chains of its so-called guardians? In Brussels, the deal was read as more than trade. It was a challenge to Europe's influence. And across Beijing's corridors of power, analysts noted the symbolism. An African nation signing with India in a way that suggested alternatives to China's sweeping investments. The West had always counted on dependency. Aid, loans, and military support were not just tools of assistance, they were levers of control. The shock was not in the amount, but in the audacity. A landlocked country, dismissed as fragile, dared to engage in a contract that echoed across continents. For decades, the assumption was that Africa could not rise without approval from the West. But in this single act, that assumption trembled. Traoré himself framed it as a battle of perceptions. They said he was too young, too reckless, too bold to be trusted. Yet in that ceremony, he carried the weight of generations. The miner who dug beneath foreign flags, the child who studied by candlelight. The symbolism was not subtle. Burkina Faso would no longer kneel. It would stand. This was the emotional peak, the moment when partnership was painted not as charity but as defiance, not as survival but as sovereignty. In his words, they do not fear our weakness, they fear our awakening. For Burkinabe listeners, this was more than rhetoric. It was vindication. For critics abroad, it was provocation. International media struggled to frame the story. Some praised India's pragmatism in securing energy for its growth. Others warned of new rivalries, of Africa caught between emerging powers. Western commentators fretted about the implications of bypassing the dollar in settlements, imagining oil flowing east while payments avoided the watchful eyes of Western banks. Analysts called it rebellion written in numbers, the start of financial independence that might inspire others. On the streets of Burkina Faso, reactions were less abstract. A market woman wondered whether the pact meant cheaper electricity. A welder hoped for steady wages from steel factories promised in the deal. A young graduate asked whether the training centers would truly open or whether they would remain as promises on paper. Skepticism and hope walked side by side. What made this moment the true climax was not just the clash of speeches, but the collision of expectations. For the first time in decades, a leader of Burkina Faso had signed something not with the outstretched hand of a beggar, but with the firm grip of a partner. That image resonated across Africa. From Dakar to Bamako, from Accra to Lagos, questions arose. Could this be replicated? Was this the start of a continental fire, a revolution by contract rather than by gunfire? At the same time, warnings abounded. Some analysts cautioned that foreign investment, no matter how generous, comes with strings. India would expect returns, leverage, and influence. The true test was not whether India would profit, it would, but whether Burkina Faso would secure enough to make the risks worthwhile. This tension, pride and doubt, hope and caution, made the pact more than a headline. It was a hinge in history, a gamble that could either cement a new legacy or collapse into disillusionment. And so the question sharpened, is this the moment when Ibrahim Traoré writes a lasting legacy? Or will history record another unfulfilled promise buried in the soil of broken dreams? Deals worth billions are not measured in signatures or ceremonies. They are measured in light bulbs glowing in rural homes, in factory gates opening at dawn, in wages placed into calloused hands at the end of a week. For the ordinary Burkinabe, the $15 billion pact was not about geopolitics. It was about whether life would finally change. The stakes could not be higher. For decades, Burkina Faso has suffered cycles of promises without delivery. Announcements of aid that never reach villages. Loans that line the pockets of the powerful while leaving citizens deeper in debt. Each disappointment fed cynicism. Each failure became a stone added to what many call the graveyard of African dreams. Against this backdrop, the oil deal with India was seen as more than an agreement. It was a test of whether history could finally break its pattern. If successful, the benefits could be transformative. Power plants fueled by Burkinabe oil might light homes where children now study by candlelight. Petrochemical factories could provide jobs for welders, engineers, and technicians. Steel plants might rise, forging rails and machines that carry the nation toward modernization. Defense workshops, built with Indian expertise but powered by local labor, could reduce dependency on foreign arms. Training centers could prepare a generation of Burkinabe youth for work in technology, agriculture, and communications. But the dangers are equally real. Foreign direct investment, however bold, comes with expectations. India will seek profit, leverage, and influence. If contracts are mismanaged, if transparency fails, the profits may flow abroad while Burkinabe workers remain spectators. If corruption seeps in, factories could become enclaves of foreign bosses, their gates closed to local dreams. This is where the true measure of leadership lies. Ibrahim Traoré cannot simply rely on the symbolism of the signing. He must ensure systems of accountability strong enough to prevent theft, oversight robust enough to prevent betrayal. Otherwise, the pact risks becoming another headline without harvest. The people of Kaya, Kudugu, and Bobo Dioulasso will not forgive another broken promise. In this sense, the deal is not just a transaction. It is a referendum on governance. It asks whether Burkina Faso can build institutions strong enough to manage billions without losing its soul. It challenges citizens themselves to demand vigilance, to insist that the factories rise, that the lights stay on, that the schools open. Here lies the question of legacy. What will history write about this moment? Will it call it the birth of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, a leader who seized an opportunity and translated it into jobs, dignity, and sovereignty? Or will it call it yet another betrayal where billions vanished into offshore accounts while citizens remained in poverty? The answer is not predetermined. It lies in the discipline of governance, the transparency of contracts, the participation of citizens. It lies in whether the pact delivers more than words, more than ink, more than hope. And it lies in whether Burkina Faso can balance the temptations of short-term gain with the demands of long-term nation building. For if this deal collapses into corruption, it will not only be Traoré's failure, it will be wielded by skeptics across the world as proof that Africa cannot govern itself, which is why the next steps are decisive. This is not simply a question of economics, but of identity. Will Burkina Faso prove that it can rise from dependency into dignity? Or will history record this as another grave where dreams were buried? The ink has dried. The cameras have gone. What remains is the harder battle, to turn a contract into a country's renewal. And so we ask, is this pact the seed of a new era or another chapter in the long book of disappointments? The signing in Ouagadougou was not only a national event, it was a tremor felt across continents. Regional organizations such as the African Union and ECOWAS watch closely, aware that if Burkina Faso proved capable of converting billions into real development, other nations might follow the same path. For them, the pact symbolized the possibility of an Africa less dependent on Western donors and more empowered to choose its own partners. In European capitals, the mood was uneasy. Brussels framed the deal as a geopolitical warning, a small, landlocked nation choosing India over Europe's traditional influence. Paris, long accustomed to shaping Burkina Faso's trajectory through currency ties and aid, saw the agreement as another crack in its waning authority in Francophone Africa. For decades, the CFA franc bound economies to Paris. Now discussions of settlement in rupees and francs hinted at an escape route. In Washington, analysts raised questions about the global financial system itself. For generations, oil and gas flowed through the arteries of the dollar. Yet here was a pact daring to bypass that channel. To American policymakers, the risk was not simply that Burkina Faso was signing with India. It was that others might follow, eroding the dominance of the dollar and creating pockets of trade immune to Western sanctions. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the deal was read as competition. China had long poured billions into Africa, building roads, dams, and railways. Yet India's approach appeared different. Not only infrastructure, but an exchange of energy for technology, of resources for training. For African observers, this offered a new model of partnership. Less lecture, more balance. This is where the phrase Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 becomes more than rhetoric. The vision is of a continent not as a pawn in global rivalries, but as a partner shaping its own future. A vision of African nations that no longer wait for aid, but negotiate for trade. A vision where sovereignty is not a slogan, but a structure, built in factories defended by homegrown arms and sustained by skills passed to the next generation. Yet the world is not naive. Every investment carries risks of entanglement. India, too, seeks leverage. The question is whether Burkina Faso can manage that relationship without becoming dependent in a new form. International observers caution that alignment with one partner should not mean exclusion of others. Sovereignty must rest in choice, not in chains. From the quarters of the United Nations to the markets of Dakar, the deal has been interpreted as a signal. Africa is not waiting for permission. Africa is choosing, and in that choice lies both promise and peril. So the world asks, is this pact the spark of a new order, or just another shift in the old game of power? Every gamble carries two futures, one bright, one dark. The $15 billion pact between Burkina Faso and India is no exception. For Ibrahim Traoré and his nation, the road ahead is both a promise and a peril. In the best-case scenario, the vision materializes into reality. Factories hum with life, drawing thousands of young workers into steady jobs. Oil revenues stabilize the economy, financing schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Electricity flows into rural villages where children swap candlelight for computer screens. Engineers trained under Indian programs return to design new industries, and farmers harvest crops with modern equipment, their sweat matched by machines rather than wasted by hardship. In this vision, Burkina Faso evolves from a raw exporter into a hub, a bridge between Africa and Asia, a nation that demonstrates what sovereignty built on trade, not aid, can achieve. But the darker scenario is etched into history's memory. Contracts mismanaged, funds siphoned, projects stalled, factories controlled by foreign bosses while Burkinabe workers remain at the gates. Technology transfer promised, but never delivered. The profits vanish overseas, leaving only disappointment at home. Anger spreads in markets and villages, fueling unrest. The pact collapses into another broken promise, another stone in the graveyard of African dreams. Between these futures lies the true battlefield, not in conference rooms, but in villages where light bulbs must flicker on, in classrooms where students must gain real skills, in workshops where machines must be assembled by Burkinabe hands. The success of this pact depends not on destiny, but on discipline. Transparency, vigilance, and accountability will decide whether the inked words breathe life or wither into dust. For Traoré, the challenge is generational. His signature will not be judged by the ceremony that captured headlines, but by the results 5 or 10 years from now. History will ask whether this pact became part of his legacy or part of the long list of disappointments. And for the people of Burkina Faso, the choice is collective. The pact is not a miracle, it is an opportunity. If citizens demand accountability, if leaders resist corruption, if partners respect parity, then the bright path may yet be walked. If not, the darker one awaits. At this crossroad, one question hovers like a shadow. Will Burkina Faso stumble into old patterns, or will it carve a new future where sovereignty is not a dream, but a daily reality? The road ahead is uncertain, but one truth is clear. The choice lies not in destiny, but in discipline. History will not remember the press conference. It will not linger on the polished mahogany table, nor the flash of cameras. What history will measure is whether the pact between Burkina Faso and India changed lives. Did the factories rise? Did the lights come on? Did the youth of Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, Kaya, and Koudougou find purpose, work, and dignity? This is where the Ibrahim Traoré legacy will be forged. Not in the moment of signing, but in the years of implementation. A leader is remembered not for promises spoken, but for futures delivered. If this agreement births industries, oils, and sovereignty, then his name will stand as a milestone in African history. If it collapses into corruption, it will become a cautionary tale, another broken promise to be buried among the failures of the past. The pact is not only national, it is continental. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike are watching. They ask, if Burkina Faso can rise from dependency to dignity, what prevents the rest of us from doing the same? This is the echo of the moment, an invitation to imagine a continent not as a pawn in global games, but as a partner shaping its own map. And here lies the deeper vision, Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. It is not simply about oil, steel, or defense. It is about building a future where Africa no longer kneels for aid, but stands to negotiate partnerships. A future where sovereignty is not a speech, but a structure. Where dignity is not demanded, but lived. But this vision demands vigilance. Corruption must be resisted, accountability embraced, transparency enforced. For without discipline, even the most promising seeds wither. With it, the harvest can transform not only Burkina Faso, but Africa itself. So let us ask, as history watches, will the Ibrahim Traoré legacy be one of broken promises or one of a continent awakened? The answer is not in destiny. It is in the choices made today. If this resonates with your sense of justice, stay with us. Share this story, subscribe to the channel, and join in the journey of a continent refusing to kneel. The signature may have been captured by cameras, but the future belongs to those who build.